Hi everyone, good morning. If your child is reactive, aggressive, hyperactive, has sensory processing issues, is overly sensitive, anxious, or even has poor learning, you're really going to want to hear about this reflex that I'm going to talk about today. It's a reflex that I have noticed is retained in 90% of my clients, probably even more. And when we say the reflex is retained, it's an infant reflex and it should disappear. This particular reflex should disappear around 4 months of age. If it continues to be what's called retained, then it's going to seriously affect cognition and all of those higher order skills. So it's important because until you address this reflex, it's a very foundational reflex. It affects the brain on a global level, or the functions on a global level. Some of the other primitive reflexes are more specific. This one will affect a whole bunch of stuff. So you really want to address this reflex if it's retained, because until you do, you will just be managing. You can do all the other bells and whistles, but you will be managing until you address this. So the MORO reflex is an infant reflex. It's super sweet when your child is a baby. It's the reflex where they kind of go like this with their, you kind of, if you touch them or they get startled, everything just kind of jumps out. Their limbs kind of just jump out. And things that can trigger it whenever they're infants are simple things like light, sound, touch, anything unexpected. And it's basically their fight or flight reflex. And what happens is, if it is retained, then your child is going to be in a more permanent state of fight or flight. And remember, reflexes are retained to varying degrees, so it depends on the severity of its retention. But either way, it's going to basically create an array of problems connected to emotional resilience. So in some kids, it's going to look like anxiety. Other kids, it's going to be impulsiveness or hyperactivity. In other kids, it's going to be sensory processing disorder. A lot of my clients with a retained MORO reflex have sensory processing issues to varying degrees. So again, remember, this is the reflex that helps the infant to basically alert even its caretakers that something's amiss or whatever if they're startled. But if it doesn't integrate, then the result is they're going to continue to be in a state of sensory overload, where they're maybe hypersensitive to light, hypersensitive to sound, hypersensitive to touch, and all of that stuff that should not be startling us as we get older and so forth. So what happens is, because of this, it triggers basically sensory overload. And that results in the fight or flight response from the adrenals. And the result is going to be anger, anxiety, hyperactivity, poor focus, emotional outbursts, aggression, and the list goes on. And on the surface, it might look like emotional immaturity. It might be a diagnosis of an anxiety disorder, social anxiety, ODD, so oppositional defiance, aggression. I didn't say sensory processing disorder, right? So, and I even want to say bad parenting. This is the reflex that can look to outsiders like, this kid has never been taught to, X, Y, and Z. So let me know in the comments below if maybe you have 2 or 3 kids and it's just that one child of yours who seems to be overreactive and aggressive. And when you're out in public, or maybe the schools or the teachers or whoever thinks that, this person just hasn't parented properly. And that is so often the case when our kids are struggling with learning and behavioral difficulties. So as I said, the severity of the reflex will gauge, how often or how easily they go into this fight or flight response. But keep in mind that this is going to affect so much more than just their emotional resilience. That's definitely going to be a big core of it, or part of it. But it will affect their learning. And the reason it will affect their learning is because the brain cannot learn effectively when it is in fight or flight, when it's being flooded with stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, which is the case when the brain is in survival mode. When it's in survival mode, it's operating from down here. It's not operating from the cortex, which is the higher brain levels, where our executive functioning occurs, like reasoning, planning, impulse control, decision making, all of that stuff that makes kids emotionally regulated as well as good learners. So it's also something I just want to mention because it is really important. There's a lot of reasons why this reflex can be retained. Right? I've talked quite a bit before about a lot of the kids today have retained reflexes because they aren't getting enough floor time or not enough movement and so forth. And I, again, don't want to blame because there's other reasons why kids can have retained reflexes, this chemical toxicity, heavy metal toxicity, all of that type of stuff. But trauma can actually cause this reflex and really any reflex to reappear. So your child might have developed normally and all of those reflexes integrated into the nervous system and disappeared, but maybe they went through a trauma and right, we all know that trauma is weird, right? What traumatizes one kid is fine for another kid. So a trauma can cause the reflex to resurface, and this is again going to affect their emotional resilience. So if you know your kid here's an example. I had a client, her child, she knew had gone through a trauma. It was a really nasty divorce. There was abuse and so forth that had taken place earlier in the marriage. And she knew that her child had gone through trauma. We don't know if the MORO reflex in her child was always retained or if it became retained or resurfaced as a result. But either way, it was on. And what we wanted to do was work on integrating it so that would calm down the fight or flight response and get her child into a better spot to be able to better emotionally regulate and learn and so forth. So important to know that this reflex, like many of them, doesn't just affect the brain, doesn't just affect cognition or memory or emotional resilience, it will affect health as well. And so when a child or a person is in a constant state of fight or flight, it starts to really fatigue their adrenals. They're going to have less adaptability, resilience to stress, harder time with transitions. We see that in our autistic children, right? But it's going to also result, as the body just becomes more depleted and unable to cope, these are the kids who are more likely to have seasonal allergies, food sensitivities or food allergies, asthma, eczema, autoimmune conditions, even stuff like PANS and PANDAS. So it will affect their physical health. They will have digestive issues because that's very much connected to the fight or flight response. So if your child is struggling with a few of these physical issues or health issues, then this is definitely something you want to dig into. Let me know in the comments below in the replay or the live. Does any of this sound like your child? Does any of this resonate or make you go, oh my goodness, this is like a textbook picture of my child? So as I mentioned, if this reflex is still present after 6 months, the long and the short of it is the result is a child who has uncontrollable impulses and reactions that basically bypasses or overrides your child's higher level thinking, their cortex, and their ability to think and reason. So you can do all the parenting strategies or, little tricks of the trade and so forth. But until we get that reflex retained, it's going to be something that's going to be basically instinctive. It is not going to be something that they can control. And so the big piece of the puzzle is getting that reflex integrated. So big thing to look for is there hypersensitivity in different ways, either anxiety, ODD, whatever the case may be, or overreactivity. So it could be aggression or blowing things out of proportion, like which we so often see with anxiety. So when the MORO reflex is retained, to kind of put this in really simple and to break it down, it will affect, number one, emotional resilience, and that can present as things like ODD and anxiety disorder. It will affect sensory processing. This can lead to diagnosis like sensory processing disorder, autism spectrum disorder, and it will affect the vestibular, the visual, and the oculomotor function. So this is tied to reading. So it will not only affect things or can result in diagnosis like ADHD, dyslexia, autism spectrum as well as learning disability. So you really want to address it because it's like I said, one of the reflexes that is retained in 95% of my clients. So at this point, you might be wondering, what are some of the signs of a retained MORO reflex? I'm going to kind of run through a list. I would love for you to just comment below in the live or the replay which ones you're seeing, which ones you're noticing, if this sounds like it applies to your child. So poor emotional regulation, I've mentioned that one. Poor balance and coordination, so that one is affected as well by the MORO reflex. Shy, anxious, hyper-aware, aggressive, overreactive. I mentioned sensory processing disorder. So sometimes that can be hypersensitive to sound, texture, light, and sometimes it might be that they're sensory seeking. And it's important to know that distinction. So they might actually be constantly touching stuff, or they don't know their own force, or they're too rough with the other kids. We see this a lot with our ODD kids, where they're too rough or they don't know their own strength. They might have, especially I see this in teenagers who have a retained MORO reflex, depression, mood swings or mood disorders. They might even be prone to motion sickness. And again, I mentioned dyslexia and all of that type of stuff. Other things is tense muscle tone. That fight or flight will just really start to affect their muscle tone. And in adults, yes, adults can have a retained MORO as well. It could have been a lifelong thing. They might be the ones with chronic, neck and shoulder pain or back pain or headaches, because they're just in this constant tense state. And after years of being in that state, it's going to really start to affect the system. And I actually had a client we were working with her daughter, but she was working on herself at the same time, which is the beauty of my programs. And she had been diagnosed with fibromyalgia, and her symptoms of fibromyalgia were so much better when she started integrating some of her reflexes, and not surprisingly, one of them was a retained MORO reflex. Other really interesting things or signs with this reflex is that it will affect or it will cause light sensitivity, but also difficulty with black print against white paper. So something that we often see, right, with our kids who have reading difficulties, visual processing disorder, and so forth. And it can even create challenges with eye movements, visual perception, Irlen syndrome, all that type of stuff. And I did mention difficulty with adaptability and transitions and so forth. So the good news is you can integrate this reflex in 6 weeks, or sorry, I shouldn't guarantee 6 weeks, but it can be integrated in 6 weeks. It can take longer. It totally depends on the child and the severity of the retention of the MORO reflex. So if you found this helpful, if you want to learn more, you're wondering, how do I know if this reflex is actually present? I'm going to be hosting a free web class on Saturday, February 27th at 10 a.m. Eastern. And we're going to be talking about that, about different retained reflexes, what they can affect, and how you're going to get a whole freebie on how to test for that in your own home. And basically in this web class, you're going to learn the 3 simple secrets that I use with my clients in my program to truly address the root cause of learning and behavioral difficulties, so that we can get past the tutoring, the meds, the IEP the limitations of IEPs, meds, tutoring, all of that type of stuff. So I will post the link in the comments below to register for that if you're interested. And if you are interested in my program, the Full Potential Formula, do reach out and book a free clarity call and we can chat. So thanks for watching, everyone. Have a great day.